the vast bulk of the Canadian population is in favor of neutrality in the Israel-Palestine conflict, as successive polls show. This is in many ways healthy, this sort of mass popular Canadian opinion that we should instead be neutral. It shows a significant lagging behind on the part of the Canadian population. There's not yet full support for the level of rejection of Palestinian rights we see from the establishment. And it's healthy, and we need to engage that sentiment. But I think as a Palestine solidarity movement, as an anti-war activist, we really can't adopt it. Because the truth is, it is also based on a myth. The idea that Canada was previously neutral is not true, and we're not being particularly helpful by underestimating how entrenched in Canadian policy is racism generally and a willingness to reject Palestinian rights specifically. To talk about the recent developments in terms of Canadian Israel advocacy, though, we do have to go a little bit further back to talk about the institutions that are responsible. So decades before this, Israel advocacy institutions didn't have tons of control over Canadian foreign policy, but had certainly established control over mainstream Canadian Jewish organizations. So already by the 1970s and 1980s, the institutions that are sort of regarded as the mainstream Canadian Jewish organizations, institutions like the Canada-Israel Committee, but particularly the Canadian Jewish Congress, had been brought under the effective control of the groups which in Canadian Jewish history represented the urban corporate establishment of the Jewish community. So these citywide fundraising federations, again, historically, these did not represent the entirety of the Jewish community. They represented the urban corporate establishment of the Canadian Jewish community. But by means of their financial power, they were able to essentially, by the 70s and 80s, have effective control over the direction of institutions like the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Canada-Israel Committee. At the same time as they were establishing that control, this fundraising federation system was linking itself to the United States in a very direct way. So these federations merged in the 70s and 80s with their American counterparts. So by the late 1990s, these fundraising structures were part of a North American-wide system, which isn't particularly Canadian, but is a continental advocacy system organized into 5 regional categories. I have West, Southeast, Northeast, Central, and Canada. So, again, 4 of the regions of this federation system are in the United States, and it's a U.S.-dominated system represented in Canada by an institution called the United Israel Appeal Federations Canada, UIAFC. So this UIAFC, by the late 1990s, was the dominant institution, again, not representing the Canadian Jewish community as a whole, but dominating the mainstream organizational expressions of the Jewish community as they sort of developed in the late 20th century. And it's this UIAFC that was the base for the launching of the offensive that we've witnessed in recent years. So this happened essentially in 2002, when concern in this pro-Israel establishment over the growth of Palestine solidarity and over the potential threat to Canadian support for Israeli apartheid resulted in the creation of what was called an Israel Emergency Cabinet. This Israel Emergency Cabinet was brought together initially, I believe, by Jerry Schwartz, president of the head of Onyx Corporation, and along with Heather Reisman, the CEO of Chapters Indigo Books. And they brought a range of other powerhouses from the federation system together and established themselves as this group called CIJA, the Canadian Council for Israel and Jewish Advocacy. CIJA is a group of 18 to 22 corporate Canadian tycoons that have essentially directed the Israel advocacy offensive we've seen in Canada since 2002. And formally and absolutely subordinated the leadership and the policies of the Canada-Israel Committee and the Canadian Jewish Congress to this 18 to 22 person board of corporate Canadian tycoons. So when we talk about the Canadian Jewish Congress, we can talk historically about how in the 1930s it served as it likes to describe itself, a parliament of all Canadian Jews, where genuinely you did have Jews in the thousands coming and making some sort of decision. Okay, now the leadership is formally subordinated to an 18 to 22 person board of corporate Canadian tycoons, in no meaningful sense representative of the Canadian Jewish community, and with sort of incidental support, but they control it by virtue of fundraising power, etc. The context is one in which the Canadian establishment, for reasons independent of any of these developments, was very intent on maintaining, and remains very intent on maintaining, a close alliance with the U.S. establishment and with U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the pattern has always been Canadian support for U.S. foreign policy, but we saw in the spring 2003 invasion of Iraq, limits in Canadian participation in U.S. aggression emerge. This shouldn't be overstated. Canadian munitions companies supplied ammunition for the U.S. invasion. Canadian Armed Forces supplied limited logistical help for the U.S. invasion, but diplomatic support was withheld. And the U.S. was annoyed. The U.S. was pretty annoyed with Canada, and the Canadian corporate establishment was really concerned about the diplomatic fallout from the United States. So as Paul Martin took control over the Liberal Party, we saw an effort across the board in Canadian foreign policy to again reaffirm Canadian support for the U.S. empire. I mean, again, not just in Palestine. In February of 2004, Canadian forces joined their U.S. and French counterparts in overthrowing the democratically elected government in Haiti and instituting a brutal client regime. In Afghanistan, Canadian combat operations expanded with the effort of supporting U.S. foreign policy objectives. Now, the role of CIJA in this context was to ensure that as Canadian elites were seeking to reaffirm their alignment with the U.S. empire, that increasing support for Israel was going to be part of this. And they did so with some success. So some of the first indications came in November of 2004. In late November of 2004, incidentally, at the beginning of that month, Paul Martin addressed the CIJA gathering saying, "You've got a good friend in Israel," and that afternoon spoke to the butcher Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister of Israel. At the end of the month, there was a bunch of votes that came up on the Israel-Palestine conflict in the United Nations, and Canada shifted its voting patterns increasingly in favor of Israel against the Palestinian people in late November of 2004. John Ibbitson, who was a lead columnist for the Globe and Mail, wrote an article at the time called "In Case You Missed It, Our Mideast Policy Has Shifted." And he talked about these changes whereby the Canadian government had joined the U.S., Israel, Australia, and a tiny cluster of other close U.S. allies in opposition to the international consensus affirming Palestinian rights. And he described it, and he attributed it to essentially two factors. He said, on the one hand, it's no coincidence that these voting changes happened just as U.S. President George W. Bush was en route to a state visit in Ottawa. Clearly, the Canadian government wanted to present something in terms of its utility to U.S. power. But Ibbitson from the Globe and Mail, not a particularly progressive guy, also said that CIJA, and he named CIJA and Jerry Schwartz in particular, among others, had, from the domestic side of things, been pressuring the Martin government to increase support. And this combination of pressure from the United States itself for alignment and from the U.S.-linked corporate establishment loyal to Israel had precipitated these changes, with Canada increasing its diplomatic support for Israel in its war against the Palestinian people. In this context, the Harper government took control, of course, after the election. And on the one hand, the Harper government is just, for other reasons, very supportive of Israel. The Harper government is very into this sort of ideology of the solidarity of the Western world against the Arab world and against the Muslim world, and this entails support for Israel. Similarly, the Harper government is very oriented towards alignment with the United States at all costs. That's its vision. But at the same time, I think one of the things that's been driving the over-the-top pro-Israel policy of the Harper government is an effort to win corporate backers from the Liberal Party to the Tories. These institutions I've been describing have historically been, like, this is important corporate fundraising muscle, and it's historically been associated with the Liberal Party. Jerry Schwartz, for example, was the main campaign contributor for Paul Martin's leadership race. And across the board, that's true of these institutions. In the creation, in the establishment of these groups and in their strategy, their multi-partisan strategy, I think the Harper government has seen an opportunity to win a corporate base of support that was previously Liberal over to the Tories. And it seems that the Israel advocacy institutions are really trying to encourage this. So we saw again in we saw through the summer this over-the-top support on the part of the Harper government for the assault on Gaza, on the West Bank, and on Lebanon. Heather Reisman took the occasion of the Harper government's over-the-top support for Israeli war crimes to say, I've been a long-time Liberal Party member, but I'm now switching my allegiance over to the Tories. At the same time, Jerry Schwartz, through a CJA press release, gave his support, saying Harper's been doing a very good job with this. And I can go into more specifics. I mean, there was a conservative caucus in Ontario where a lot of the CJA members took out